Welcome, everyone. A very good afternoon to all of you. Thank you so much for joining us for this webinar. My name is Abhinav, and I work with the Urban Practitioners Program at IIHS, and I'll be your host and moderator for this webinar. This episode is part of a larger CDF webinar series, which happens every quarter of the year. And for those of you who do not know about CDF, CDF is the Capacity Development Forum, and it is a platform that brings together different practitioners to facilitate an exchange of ideas and knowledge on capacity development, institutional capacity, pedagogical methods, among others, and to create a repository of knowledge that everyone can access. And this episode, we will observe the Urban October, which is an initiative by the UN Habitat. And this year's theme focuses on the youth. So therefore, we will discuss state capacity and the role of youth in building India's urban future. So before we start, I would like to make a few housekeeping announcements. There's a chat box and a Q&A box. Feel free to put your thoughts, reflections, or anything, any concerns in your chat box, and put your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll be addressing them towards the end of the conversation. So with that said, it is my great pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker, Mr. Subhashish Bhadra. Subhashish is an accomplished economist and the author of the book Cage Tiger: How Too Much Government is Holding Indians Back. His expertise spans a variety of fields, having worked at prestigious organizations such as McKinsey and Company, the venture capital firm Omidyar Network, and the FinTech Startup Club. He holds an impressive academic background as well, with an MPhil in economics from the University of Oxford, where he was a Rhodes Scholar, and a BA in economics from St. Stephen's College, New Delhi. Today, Subhashish will share his insights on state capacity, drawing from his extensive experience in economics, governance, and policy. Welcome to this webinar, Subhashish.
Thanks, Abhinav, for inviting me.
Yeah. So my first question is, basically, in the book Cage Tiger, you have written extensively about the concept of state capacity, right? I want to begin by asking you, what motivated you to write on state capacity, and how have your past experiences shaped or influenced the key thoughts of the book?
So thanks, Abhinav, for that question. The context for this was that for about 5.5 years, I worked with Omidyar Network India, which is a philanthropy that works on several issues, including issues around governance. And as we started working on governance, even though that was not necessarily my focus area, but that obviously extends to everything that you do. So you think about financial inclusion, you think about education. Governance is almost like that horizontal, which supports all of these areas and sectors. As you start thinking about it, obviously there's a fair amount of knowledge out there about state capacity, about accountability, about concepts such as those. However, the engagement of youth in questions around state capacity still tend to be fairly low. If you look at recent surveys, there are a large percentage of youth who claim that, look, politics is not for me, or it's going to politicize, or these are not conversations I can have with friends and family. In a sense that I think, especially with the onset of social media, and the people who, the citizens of our country who are now below the median age, typically are those who were brought up in that internet generation. And I think in that internet generation, our patience with public policy, our wherewithal to really stand its push and pulls has weakened significantly. So to that extent, Cage Tiger, from my perspective, was to really write about the topic of state capacity in a way that engages more younger people into the conversation. So which is why the book's written in a deliberately accessible manner, but also in terms of how you promote it, right? So I did a lot of Instagram reels and stuff like that, a lot of digital marketing, and all of it was to get more young people into this conversation, so that state capacity and public policy in general doesn't remain that area where it's only older people who engage with that.
Yeah, that's a very interesting journey, and yeah, I also echo that some of the conversation has been very difficult, and it has kind of stopped or maybe discouraged people to express what they actually feel. Since you talked about like how you actually come about the conceptualization of this book and how you came about writing about state capacity. So, in your maybe like in your words, how would you define state capacity, and what are the key aspects of state capacity we could look at?
So I think I don't know about the definitions of state capacity because obviously anything to do with government, right? Starting, if you think about what is government, and this is honestly a question that I grapple with in the book as well. The government is essentially a set of, or institutions are a set of formal and informal rules that we put around ourselves. The formal part of it is probably largely in the domain of government and therefore state capacity. Informal norms tend to be like the culture, morality, etc. So those are informal institutions. The formal institutions, which are written down codified laws, therefore lead to this question of state capacity, which then becomes the ability of the state to both conceptualize, draft, implement, and I would say review laws or rules or regulations, anything that formally regulates the ordinary lives of citizens, becomes what is called state capacity. Of course, in the context of a liberal democracy such as India, the purpose and of the state capacity also becomes important. So you can obviously do all these things in a fairly authoritarian country or a kingdom or an empire. But in the case of a liberal democracy, obviously the purpose of the state capacity is to overall improve the well-being and happiness of its citizens. So that's how I think of state capacity. It is the ability to conceptualize, draft, implement, and review formally written down rules which are in the service of benefiting the country's citizens.
Okay. We also at IIHS, we engage with a lot of capacity building programs, and we look at capacity also at the individual, there's institutional level capacities, and we also had opportunities to engage with ecosystem level capacity to draft policies and contribute to policy making and legislation as well. So we understand that there are capacities at different levels that are required, and maybe different capacities are required at different levels. But like good that you mentioned about the purpose, right? So when we talk about building an effective state or building an effective state capacity, what should be the especially maybe in the Indian context, what should be that overarching purpose that we need to look towards?
Yeah, so I'll get to the purpose in a moment, right? But
Yeah.
also going on your previous question of talking about the constituents of state capacity. Now to implement both of those tracks, which is the ability to do it as well as the right purpose to do it, there are essentially, I think, two categories in which you could categorize state capacity. The one that is spoken about a lot more is what I might call capabilities. Right, which is the ability to do all the things that I mentioned that we should do. And when you think about capabilities, I think two or three things really stand out as its sub-constituents. One is manpower, right? You need to have the people to be able to do those things. And if you think in the context of India, for example, the number of public servants we have per million citizens is about give or take 16,000. Whereas in a country like the US, that number is about 76,000. So it's almost an order of five difference between the two. And even in the 16,000 per million government servants that we have in India, about 44% are just in the railways, which one might even argue is not really state capacity. It could, it's a particular service. So to that extent, I think the Indian state needs more manpower, and that is, of course, something that is well known. The second is the knowledge and skill, that once you have the people in place, do they have sufficient knowledge and skills to be able to implement the policies well? And of course, the Indian government has been largely in that sense an effective government. The fact that we're holding our country together and have made a substantial progress in many areas means we do have that knowledge and skills. But I think increasingly, in a more complex, complicated, and fast evolving world, the requirement of knowledge and skills goes much deeper than perhaps where it is today. And of course, many commentators have argued that if you look at the fact that in the IAS frequent transfers take place, and therefore you don't get the time to build expertise in a particular domain, is something that's going against that ability to do so. So the second constituent of state capacity becomes knowledge and skills. And the third aspect, which kind of affects the other two, is in terms of the financial resources of the state, And this goes back to the early 1900s when a lot of research was done, which said, in the medieval times, it was this warcraft and therefore the need to raise taxes that was the initial impetus to state capacity historically, and even the definition of nation states. And to that extent, the ability of a country to raise resources is a very critical part of its state capacity. And if you look at India, for example, our budgets are typically about 29% of the GDP, whereas the OECD average is about 46%. So I think, of course, we are getting better with formalization and GST and all of that, but there's a long way to go. So those are what I would think of as capabilities, and that is typically something that has seen the greatest amount of interest from people who think about state capacity. But the second one, which is perhaps what I explore a little bit more in my book, is in terms of accountability. That you might have all the ability to do things, but your ability to do the right things or the things that matter for your citizens is where this whole accountability aspect comes in. And to your question of purpose, that's purpose can be different for different citizens. I, as a citizen of India, might have a very different purpose and need than a citizen in the US or in Norway. And therefore, it's not something that's fixed in time. It's also going to be something that's intergenerationally very different, right? I mean, our parents' aspirations and purpose in life might have been very different from ours. So the idea of building purpose into this question of state capacity is by making it accountable in a very dynamic way. And out there, if you think of it, I think three things critically matter, and which is what I write in my book as well. The first is to have a tightly written law. Very often, laws are written in a way that gives a lot of discretion to the government without saying exactly what is the government or government body doing. If you look at, for example, the Securities and Exchange Commission of the US, then in its regulation, it very clearly lays down here are the four purposes for which the SEC is set up. So that as a citizen, I can go and measure is the SEC doing a good job or not. And that's the kind of tightly written laws that we require. The second is in terms of transparency and adherence to that law, that you might have the best law in the world, but if nobody knows whether it's working or not, unless you have some data out there, it's very difficult to say whether that scheme is working or not. So to that extent, for example, the PDS is a fantastic example where we have certain data based on NSSO surveys on how much food grain is actually reaching people. And only then we can kind of measure the effectiveness of the PDS. But there are many schemes, not in India, but globally as well, where you can't measure that effectiveness, and therefore the ability to improve is lower. And finally, you need something like an independent oversight. That you might have the best law, you might have transparent adherence, but if I can't do anything about the adherence, if I as a citizen can't complain to anyone, then it's kind of useless. So to give a good example of that, there's a civilians complaints review board in New York where civilians can go and complain about any kind of police atrocities or misdeeds. And in in a 10-year time frame ending in 2020, from what I recollect, there were about 3,000 odd investigations that were run by this body. And there, in fact, 7 police officers were recommended for dismissal based on the complaints of this body. And just to be clear, this body has no representatives from the police. So in that sense, it's a completely independent check on the citizens and on the police in that case. So I think this accountability and this responsiveness to citizens is what gives state capacity a more purpose-driven angle.
That's a very interesting facts, and like that is also a striking fact that you mentioned that there is lack of manpower, lack of capabilities, and lack of knowledge. And but the other discourse is that, which is also echoed in your book, that there is also too much interference from the government. There is too much government, right? That is also the other discourse. So how would you like to reconcile both these kind of
That was
narratives?
a very deliberate choice on my part to, I mean, if I could not rewrite the title, but if there was an alternative title for a more academically oriented audience, I would say how too much unaccountable government holds Indians back. The problem in India is not that there is too much government, and I don't think any of us would argue that, right? Because in so many areas of our lives, we find the lack of government or the lack of governance is a problem, right? I mean, the cleanliness or lack thereof of our streets, sometimes the lack of policing or the vulnerabilities that people face can point to a lack of government, right? But the challenge in India has been that where the government puts its mind, it is able to typically do a fairly good job of it, right? I don't think any country in the world would have rolled out a national ID project at the pace that India did, and especially at the cost that India did. So obviously, when we put our mind to Aadhaar and ran it as a focused project, we as a country were able to get it done. People often keep talking about the capacities of organizing the Kumbh Mela and everything else, so many other things that we do. We have the highest electricity penetration for a country at our income level. We have the homicide rates in India have fallen significantly. All health indicators are improving very significantly. So obviously, no one's in that sense even arguing about the kind of the role and the temperament of the government here. But I think the challenge comes in ensuring that the government is also bound by certain rules and norms that make it responsive to citizens. And this is not just in the citizens' interest, but it is also in the government's interest, because the more the government restricts what it does and defines it in clear terms, there is transparency up and down the government system in a way that it will be able to achieve what it wants to achieve. Trying to do too many things can sometimes become a challenge, because every time you try to do too many things, your capacity is getting divided in trying to do too many different things where you might not have the right capacity and skills. So reducing the number of areas where the government intervenes and then building capacity only in those specific core areas before you go to other areas becomes really important.
Yeah, I think, yeah, that was a very interesting idea on how do you like limit the scope and try to do what they have kind of fixed on very properly. And yeah.
And I'll in fact say that this is also an idea that I found very appealing in a lot of the work that Ajay Shah has written about, which is they call this kind of building capacity through practice in a way, essentially, right? It is, I mean, India is still a new state, right? By the long history of the world, we are only about some 75 years old now as an independent country. And to that extent, it is obvious that we will not have state capacity because the regime that preceded independent India was almost 200 years of colonial rule, and colonial rule builds its institutions in a very different way. Colonial states build their institutions in a very centralized manner. Colonial institutions build their strengths in ways like railways and defense, etc., not so much in what education and healthcare, etc., which matter to citizens. So to that extent, our transition has been fairly new, and we are in that process of building it. And so at the initial stages where, for example, our economy is not formalized enough for you to collect that kind of financial resources, so your tax to GDP ratio will be low. You also don't have other kinds of capacity. So at a time when you don't have state capacity, you try to do fewer things. And when you've matured as a country, and as you keep maturing, then you keep adding these layers to it.
Yeah, that's very interesting and very insightful take on the what's happening right now in the Indian state. Now, if we have to talk about the role of youth in maybe building an effective state, or maybe what are the pathways for young people to kind of come and maybe contribute to this conversations or in improving governance and policy making? Is there any pathways that are being provided, or is there an ecosystem that the government is actually creating?
Look, in terms of the role of the youth, I genuinely think, even from a purely narrow economic lens, that the role of youth becomes fairly important, because at the end of the day, if again, looking at it from a somewhat morbid perspective, but if the more number of years you have to live, the more dearly you will care about the future, right? In the sense that think of policy making in general, right? If you governments are often accused of having a 5-year window to policy making. Anything that will give results after 5 years, many governments are accused not of caring about those kind of things because they only care about getting re-elected. Similarly, the longer time you have left in your life, the more you'll probably care, especially about longer term issues like climate change. If you want focus to be on these long-term existential challenges that are facing us, then you need to really think about driving the youth vote, because the issues on which they vote will obviously be somewhat different from the issues on which people who are older vote. Secondly, I'd like to think that young people are also more in sync with technology, and especially with the rapid advancement in AI. I think it's important to have people who understand technology actually participate in the policy making and state capacity question. And finally, I would also like to believe that young people tend to be more idealistic, and to that extent, I think it introduces a dose of idealism into state capacity and policy making. To your second question of what are the avenues for the youth to engage? Look, at the end of at the end of the day, the primary focus that we need to have is to really live by our duties as citizens. And as citizens, many people might argue that voting or participating in the creation of that state is important, if not for us, then for people who are near and dear to us. And to the extent that, for example, India's youth participation rate in elections has been significantly lower than for older population, that's a concern. In fact, in very large states like UP and Bihar, the registration rate among 18, 19-year-olds is abysmally low at some 20 odd percent. Whereas in southern states, which tend to be slightly more developed, you see that rate actually reach about 50 to 60%. So I think just showing up and voting becomes an important thing. Other ways of participating in the policy process, sending your comments to policy submissions, etc., become fairly important as well. And finally, I would say that, look, there are areas where state capacity won't exist, or where India probably shouldn't have publicly funded state capacity at the moment, given its level of development. And that's where both the youth, but more importantly, private citizens have an obligation and an ability to come in and contribute. If you look at India's volunteering rates, for example, they tend to be significantly behind the global north countries. And that is something that probably needs to change. We need to volunteer more. We need to do more civic activities. India's retail donor base is actually very, very small. Most of the retail donation, in fact, most of retail donations go to religious events, and that I think is a problem as well. And we need to donate more to healthcare, education, those kind of issues. And finally, I think there are avenues within social entrepreneurship, etc., that the youth can explore to really supplement state capacity in areas that it may not exist in.
Yeah, I completely agree that the youth has, of course, we all can agree that the youth has a lot at stake here, and because we are inheriting the world, and also a lot of the decisions and the consequences of these decisions are kind of faced by the youth in the future. And also, good that you touched upon some of the private sector avenues as well. Like in your mind, is there any example maybe you can provide where such maybe entrepreneurial ecosystems have been provided by any state? Maybe a global example would also do, like if you can highlight.
Sure. So look, I think, as I said, I think the greatest gap in state capacity will typically be in those areas which, as I said, probably at India's stage of development, we don't have either financial resources or kind of capabilities to go into. And these will often tend to be more vulnerable or oppressed communities. So creating social enterprises which directly work with vulnerable or disadvantaged communities, in fact, I find them fairly inspiring. One of them, for example, was an Omida network portfolio company called Louis Voice Control. And what Louis Voice Control did was it made reading of the mobile interface far easier for visually challenged people. That enables them to then participate in the digital economy much better. So that's the kind of technological innovation that one might think about. But even if one doesn't think about kind of people with disability or those kind of restrictions, even if you look at something like creating products for women. There are lots of social enterprises which are looking at kind of issues around female healthcare, etc., and developing products around that. There are also online digital spaces that are being created in a more women-centric manner, where women can kind of come in and discuss their issues, talk about maternal health, etc. So I think these kind of spaces, especially for historically oppressed communities, I think is certainly one area where social enterprises have a significant role to play. But that said, if you look at many for-profit companies, in some way or the other, they tend to have a social angle. And I think for whoever's interested in social enterprises in general, it's really their decision to choose which of these levels of social impact they want to choose.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting, and that's an array of options actually we can maybe focus on. And we also talked about state, the different avenues for building state capacity itself. And the next question is about how do we actually measure or track the improvements in state capacity? Like, are there any specific indicators or benchmarks we can rely on, to track the improvement of governance or institutions per se?
So, obviously, governance in institutions um, is a very tricky thing to measure in any way,
Mm,
right? One looks for
yeah.
indicators of governance. Indicators of governance could be indicators like what percentage of people paid a bribe. But that, as you know, is fairly difficult to capture in surveys. One can look at what is the crime level in the society, because that talks about policing capacity. But even that, I think, suffers from that dichotomy of in increasing rate can also just indicate to better reporting and formalization of crimes, right? So there are a few indicators that one can use to talk about state capacity, but I do think that most of these tend to be imperfect indicators in that sense, or imperfect output indicators. Therefore, one can look at input indicators of state capacity and use those as proxies. So as I said, tax to GDP ratio really is a very strong indicator of state capacity, because it measures the state's ability to collect taxes from its very divergent economic activity taking place on its territory. And that, I think, is a fairly difficult task, and therefore indicates state capacity in a fairly good way. Another way for us to really talk about state capacity would be, again, things like enrollment rates, things like healthcare indicators, because all of these from different sector to sector become indicators of the state's capacity to actually implement things in those sectors. So the way I would think about state capacity, Abhinav, truly is to look at what are the aspects that matter to citizens. Law and order matters, education matters, healthcare matters. And the ability of the state to be successful in all of these is what state capacity is all about.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And as I think capacity building practitioners and also most of the audience are also looking at this conversation about measuring and about evaluating the progress of our efforts becomes very crucial, to actually ensure that we are moving in the right direction. And so I wanted to kind of move on to the role of CB practitioners from here. And from the lens of capacity building, whether it could be individual capacity building or institutional or making changes at the policy level, legislative level, what avenues do you see emerging, like what CB practitioners can look towards? And also maybe I mean, also in the public sector, there is a significant capacity building effort that being undertaken, but also there's also emerging private sector which is trying to fill that gap. So from that private sector perspective, what avenues do you see for CB practitioners like us?
So look, we have to start from the point of view of, again, as a country at India's economic level, with the years of independence we've had, obviously state capacity will leave much to be desired. And therefore the private sector, which would be think tanks and concerned citizens and everyone else, will have a fairly substantial role in bridging state capacity. And if you look at just the narrower question of capacity of the state to deliver and how do private sector folks work on that, there are two or three things that come to mind. One is, at the end of the day, I think AI is going to be fundamentally transformative in the way that our society runs. And in general, private sector will be far quicker to adapt to AI than the public sector will be. So whatever capacity building practitioners can do to advance the adoption of AI in the public sector will actually be exponentially useful. And in particular, two use cases that quite excite me about the use of AI in state capacity is firstly the policy process. As I spoke about earlier, that policy process, ideally in any kind of democracy, while parliament obviously represents the will of the people, but many advanced democracies have done a good job of ensuring that most major proposals go through a public consultation process. Obviously, in a country of 1.3 billion people, that's a difficult task to do, especially with all the languages that exist in the country, and the ability of our population with its literacy level, especially at the secondary and tertiary levels, to actually absorb public policy, which is fairly legalese document, into something that they can really understand and provide inputs into. To that extent, I think the ability of AI to simplify public policy process, both at the level of the person providing the policy input, as well as the government's ability to absorb those policy inputs, becomes important. Secondly, a lot of the disaffections that Indian citizens have with the state is with respect to its lack of responsiveness. And if you come to think of it, that lack of responsiveness becomes somewhat obvious in light of the manpower challenges that the Indian state faces. So the ability of AI to actually ease the citizen and government interface will be important, because a lot of the questions that citizens have is really in navigating a whole bunch of information that is already out there. So to the extent that we can train Gen AI on these kind of laws and regulations such that the citizen state interface becomes much easier, that will be great. So I do think that the private sector, which is think tanks and social entrepreneurs, etc., have a key role to play in using technology to improve state capacity through means such as these. The second, I would say, is in keeping with the theme of today, which is youth and state capacity. I mean, as much as we might blame the government for being a gerontocracy. So, for example, the average age of an MP is above 50 years, whereas the median age of an Indian citizen is less than 30. Even I don't count as youth by most definitions of what the youth is. So, to that extent, if if we want the government to be more representative and younger, I think think tanks also have an obligation, and public policy has an obligation to be younger. I was recently at a conference in Kerala, and out there, I was probably among the youngest people in the room, and I'm 33. And the fact that even in a private setting, we still absolutely exclude the lower half of the Indian age demographic is, I think, quite problematic. So the ability to involve the youth and then let the youth iterate on what is the best way to build state capacity. Maybe it is through leveraging technology a lot more in building behavior change, because obviously behavior change can otherwise be a fairly slow process. Maybe it is using tech and AI in other ways in targeting our welfare systems better, etc. But I think once we build the foundation of the youth having been involved in the public policy process, from there, I think getting to state capacity is a far easier route.
Yeah, that's yeah, you covered a bunch of things actually, like, and also with the evolving trends of automation and AI, I also assume that a lot of the processes within the government system is also going to transform. And how do you think the system of public administration itself transforming because of this, outside forces such as AI and automation?
There will definitely be many. I think government from 30 years from now will look fundamentally different. And as young people, I think we will be certainly around to see it. So we have a stake in the game. Some of the ways in which the government, I believe, is going to change, or state capacity needs to change. First, I think a lot of our issues are going to become global issues. Climate change is one. There's nothing India can do in isolation on climate change. Tech India is the other. Like India cannot be isolated in any way from the AI revolution that's coming. So if you think of climate change and AI as two exponential threats and opportunities for citizens, to that extent, policy making is going to become far global in its nature. And therefore, the kind of state capacity we need is also the state capacity that can engage with foreign stakeholders, which can build consensus, which can find that fine balancing line between our national interest and global interest, will become really important. The second aspect of state capacity, I believe, is that for those working in capacity building, they will now need to traverse very, very divergent viewpoints. The reasons I say that is we have seen in the US that because of the spread of the internet, political polarization has become far more intense. The possibility of a Democrat voting for a Republican or vice versa, or a Democratic senator voting for a Republican idea and vice versa, have gone down exponentially in the US because of political polarization. And while we don't have such studies in India, we should assume that it has already happened or it is in the process of happening. And similarly, I think the fragmentation in our political system has increased. There are a lot more regional parties. There are a lot more parties which represent certain social communities. And therefore, you have to take all of them along to be able to build consensus. So the future of capacity building and state capacity will be in this idea of the ability to build consensus. Otherwise, much like the US seems to be on the path of, we might become such a polarized society that on many issues we might shoot ourselves in the foot just because we're not able to find more common ground. And the final thing, and which keeps me very hopeful, is that with a lot of the measures that have been taken politically and otherwise, I think our public spaces are becoming far more diverse. Uh, Obviously, we have hard reservations that are there in legislatures and in other branches. But I think that's also percolating down to day-to-day levels as we find historically oppressed and marginalized communities come more into the mainstream. The representation in public space, I think, is going to increase. And that's also fundamentally going to change the nature of public policy and change the capacity of the state, because these marginalized communities are going to stand up to government and say, hey, look, even though we might be 10%, 5% of the population, but especially in a first past the post electoral system like India, we matter. So to that extent, the fact that state capacity is going to take a more global lens, the fact that the state capacity will need to balance competing priorities a lot more, and third, that it's going to become more representative of oppressed communities is, I think, what the future of capacity building and state capacity will look like.
I mean, that's both fascinating and also scary at the same time. And if you look, even you spoke about the increasing polarization in the US and some trends. Like a situation like that, I mean, it's hard to say there are any like best cases or best practices or any models that India can look towards. So in a case where we don't have any models to look towards, like even the China model also doesn't really fit in with the Indian democratic kind of situation. What where can we actually kind of derive certain solutions or inspirations for improving our system?
The example that I like to give, and this is from one of the books written by this year's Nobel Prize winners in economics, is around Sweden and Germany in the after the First World War, where both the countries obviously went through the global depression and were affected by it, and there was a certain amount of social upheaval that both the countries saw. We know how that played out in Germany, that dissatisfaction was channelized by the Nazi party to create essentially what became a dictatorial and single party rule, which was very harmful to many of its citizens. Whereas what happened in Sweden was the political leadership of that time said, hey, instead of being confrontational with the other group, let me go and try to find a sense of common ground with that other group. So it might have been industrialists and farmers at that time, and even now in many cases one might believe these two groups are opposed to each other, but that the political leadership in Sweden in the interwar period was able to form coalitions of an industrialist with the farmer and other kind of disparate groups such that they served all their common interests. And in the long term, we have then obviously seen how that has played out in the Scandinavian countries, where they typically tend to have higher happiness levels, higher well-being levels. Their translation of economic prosperity into national well-being and individual well-being tends to be much higher. And if one draws lessons from that kind of a politics and that example, then what it means for us as citizens and for us as a country is firstly for us to create safe spaces around ourselves, for us to seek out and talk to people. Because if you see survey after survey, a lot of young people in particular say, I don't want to speak about political issues because I find it leads to confrontation. And for us to be able to create that, but more importantly, for us to also look at our politics not as a zero-sum game where there's a constant pie and we're fighting for divisions of that pie, but to say, okay, how do we collectively come together and grow that pie? So I always turn back to that Sweden versus Germany example in the interwar period. Obviously, it's not applicable in any situation. Obviously, it is many years ago in a completely different geography, but I think it gives a very good and compelling example of what happens in the different kind of paths that state capacity can take.
That's interesting. So that also calls for a main behavioral change kind of requirement also in the masses, and because we are taking a point of view from the citizens and how we can actually make people aware about and create spaces around us, and then more like a bottom-up approach towards changing, making institutional change. Do you also think that because there are also specific state institutions which are focused on creating an ecosystem for behavioral change, like Capacity Building Commission, or it could be Niti Aayog, which is doing a lot of initiatives. What can be the role of the state in creating such a space for the citizens to thrive and make that behavioral shift?
State capacity obviously has two elements, right? Which was, or in fact, three now. There's capabilities, accountabilities, and now we're talking about behavioral change as well. When you talk about capabilities, that's obviously been the focus of a fair amount of work that's being done, as you rightly said, by the Capacity Building Commission. And even when you think about the Capacity Building Commission, it's very interesting that the kind of courses that are doing well often relate to the human elements of the bureaucracy. So I was recently told that the most popular course on the Capacity Building Commission is actually around a course by one of the yoga teachers around kind of mindfulness and stress management. So the fact that, and this points to the fact that our bureaucracy is, in that sense, is fairly overworked. There's also prevention of sexual harassment and other kind of softer aspects that do make it to the top 5 of what courses are most popular with the Capacity Building Commission. So I think there's certainly a fair amount of work that is being done. If you look at the other aspects of what I called capabilities, then a fair amount of work that is being done in terms of increasing the tax base and kind of getting more taxation and deepening of the tax net, and that's been happening as well. There is also the fact that we are also willing now increasingly to bring in external expertise. And of course, that can be a fairly contentious issues in terms of lateral entry into the civil services, but there are certainly measures, if not as full-time employees, to actually bring them in some capacity and bring in that expertise. On the capabilities front, I think a fair amount of work is being done. On the accountability front, at the end of the day, it's not really in the domain of the Niti Aayog and Capacity Building Commission. Accountability is something that has to be legislated by Parliament and proposed by the executive. So to that extent, I think accountability is something where we can still go a little bit further. But if we look at some of the recent legislation that has been brought in, and by recent, I'm looking at the last 15, 20 years, things like the National Food Security Act, which does talk about setting up commissions in the states. Then obviously there is the RTI Act, which also brings in a certain amount of accountability. Then you look at the RBI amendment that was done in the 2015 or something, wherein you finally tied down the RBI to an inflation rate and brought more accountability and structure to the functions of the RBI. So those accountability measures will have to be done by Parliament, and I think we're slowly getting there, and that really is the trajectory in which most countries will go. But to your question about behavioral change, I think that's where a lot more effort needs to be given. On the electoral side and politics side, the Election Commission of India has put in special effort to bring out the vote, but it hasn't really been effective to that extent. So that behavioral change is something that I think we need to continue devoting time to. And as political parties understand the importance of the youth vote, I think we will see that improve. But apart from that as well, I think think tanks and people outside the government have a fairly important role to play in driving that behavior change, because very often they might be able to adapt to technology much better, and they might be able to, for example, deliver messaging in the right way. A lot of the government messaging that I'm sure you or I receive are things that are not really relevant for us. So to the ability to adapt and target your messaging and make it more interesting and innovative is something that I do believe that the private sector can play. In fact, there's a role even for artists and filmmakers, etc. Because even at Umida Network, we did fund a bunch of short films with the explicit idea of bringing some of this to the public consciousness. And if you look at, for example, what Al Gore's documentary in the early 2000s about climate change did for the conversation around climate change, that was very important. And I think those kind of pivotal moments and those pivotal pieces of art can be created only by the private sector, but also think tanks can actually make public policy as a space far more accessible to citizens. So I think a fair amount of work still needed on the accessibility part, with a lot that is already currently being done on the capabilities part of state capacity.
Yeah, that's very interesting that you're like throughout this, I can see that there's a lot of emphasis on the accountability of institution, and also it's very fascinating that how you mentioned the role of creative pursuits and the role of art and pop culture as well in making people aware about certain things. Also, in the book, you mentioned you have very beautifully traced some of these current existing institutions back to the colonial systems, and so in maybe such a mechanism, right? How do you really create accountable institutions? Because how just people being aware sometimes may not. Also the state has to listen to people and allow avenues for public participation as well. But how do you create that mechanism? From which angle do we proceed? Where should that conversation happen?
Understood. So, Abhinav, the way you have to think about state capacity, firstly, and I think I should have mentioned, this is one of the things that the youth really needs to gear up for, is that it takes time. From a quote that I've heard, which was attributed to Tathagat Satpathy, who used to be an MP, I don't know if it's actually his quote or not, but it said that, look, public policy is not selling soaps. It requires time and patience. So to that extent, I think younger people need to really be patient about that process of policy change. Let's be clear that for the majority of its existence, the US did not give women the right to vote. So to that extent, even their experiment with truly inclusive democracy is fairly recent. So to that extent, look, public policy processes are going to take time, and the process is going to be slow. So we need to brace for that. But now to your question of where some of those pushes and pulls of public policy and the areas for improvement in terms of accountability play out, the thing with it is it's almost like the snowball effect. You start with the kernel, which in India's case was electoral democracy, and then this electoral democracy keeps spinning into a bigger thing that then makes it a truly participative, inclusive democracy in the truest sense. To that extent, I do think in many ways India has gone in the right direction, right? If we look at, for example, the public interest litigation system, and of course, many people argue it's been abused and misused in many different ways, but to the extent that it also allows many people to actually litigate about matters of public interest without having a suo motu involvement, without having an involvement in that issue becomes really important. So that PILs have been one example. The RTI has been another example, which allow people to get information to be able to hold their public representatives accountable. So those kind of avenues for more accountability, I believe, are going to be put in place. But in addition to that, obviously, these measures don't arise by themselves unless people get educated and they talk about these issues. In fact, there has been a cross-sectional study which shows that the level of education of a citizen is directly related to the number of questions they ask, and that leads to state capacity, even in fairly authoritarian countries. And the analogy that the writer of this paper talks about is that citizens are like customers at a restaurant, and the government or the various arms of the state are the waiters. Unless you make a noise, they aren't going to listen to you. And by noise, obviously, one doesn't mean you have to do something extreme, but even the fact that you kind of talk about this on social media. And I know it's a very small example, but I remember this. Tax collected at source in one of the recent finance bills that was imposed on overseas spending led to a lot of controversy, and the government rolled it back within a couple of weeks. So even on such minor things, right, we see that kind of accountability building just by someone or a bunch of people tweeting on social media. So to that extent, I think we can drive accountability in our government by actually showing up and asking questions, be it on social media, on streets, in wherever that form, shape, or manner might take. But it has to be a long-term, patient engagement on the part of citizens to win back some of that accountability that a state that was essentially at the beginning just derived from a colonial state will not obviously have in its initial years.
That's fantastic. And I think it's almost, I mean, it's time to take the question and answers. But I really appreciate your insights on this topic. And I really appreciate how you emphasize the need for talking about institutions in our, and bringing it as a regular part of a day-to-day conversations. And that's really kind of, I really appreciate and echo that thought. So let's move towards the questions. There are a bunch of questions in the Q&A box. I'll just read out the question. The first question is, you argue for reducing government control to unleash growth. But in an increasingly interconnected urban future, is there a risk that too little state intervention could create chaos rather than freedom? How can we balance the need for order with the desire for innovation and independence? So the question is about how to manage, freedom when there's too little intervention.
On this question, I'll stand on the shoulder of giants and again quote this year's winners in the Nobel Prize who actually did their entire life's work on institutions and state capacity. And the way they think of it is as a chart where on the x-axis or one of the axes, you have state capacity. On the other axis, you have basically some version of civilian accountability. And they call it the Red Queen effect. They say that in case there's too much state capacity without that kind of accountability, then you tend to become an authoritarian country like China, or there are other examples as well, where you become far more authoritarian if civil society doesn't exist. But on the other hand, if you have too much individual liberty, or and more importantly, insufficient state capacity, then you're not even developing capacity as a state. Your ability to tax people, your ability to enforce law and order, your ability to do a whole bunch of other things just does not exist. So the answer, like the dissatisfying answer for most of public policy, is that it's both, right? To that extent, that's what they call the Red Queen effect. And the book, in fact, in which they talk about this is called The Narrow Corridor. And their point is that for human liberty and for human prosperity, you have to walk this narrow corridor between state capacity on one hand and kind of individual liberties, freedoms, autonomy on the other. In the Indian context, for example, in fact, these guys argue that in the Indian capacity, in the Indian situation, you don't have enough of a government, especially in some of the rural areas, etc. Some might argue India has too much capacity in some of these areas, like law and order, etc., and not enough in some of the other areas. The idea would be to try to get ourselves into this kind of narrow corridor where we put constraints, restraints, transparency, and accountability of the government, but at the same time, we are equipping the government through laws, regulation, or whatever else it requires to be able to deliver on those. Many people argue, for example, that the Right to Education Act was premature, that the state did not have capacity to enforce the right to education law. I do not personally have a perspective on that, but those are the kind of questions I think we need to keep asking, which is to find that fine balance. And that really is the whole journey of this narrow corridor that these authors are encouraging us to take.
That's an interesting view. The other question, I think you also touched upon it a little bit in the conversation. The question is, youth movements often focus on immediate change, while urban governance demands long-term vision. How do we balance the urgency of youth activism with the patience required for systemic transformation? And can these two timelines ever truly align?
So that is obviously tricky. That is an important question and a tricky challenge, because at a time when many of us probably are so ingrained in Instagram reels that we don't even have a patience for a 30-minute sitcom episode. To talk about long-term policy change that is going to play out over the next several decades, and some of whose most problematic aspects might even be for generation a few apart from us. I think that becomes really challenging. How do you make state capacity more forward-looking? So here, I think two or three things are important. Firstly, the fact that you have to find that, and again, in the vein of my previous answer about state capacity and individual autonomy, etc., you have to find mechanisms where some of these long-term aspects, which have a fair amount of nuance and detail, you kind of present it to the public in the right way. Again, a lot of people, for example, after the Brexit vote, argued that things such as whether to be in the European Union or not should not necessarily be put to public vote in that kind of a yes or no manner, but it should be public consultation should be sought in a different way. So I think the ability to create public policy processes where the government and people who might be able to take a long-term view, experts, etc., have the final say, but they take the public opinion. And if they're discarding parts of it, then say, okay, these are the reasons why we're discarding it. So I think that long-termism in public process will come from the fact that a state or a government lives is ideally for perpetuity, whereas citizens obviously have limited time frames. So that's one. The second is that we have to build that culture, and part of that culture comes from behavioral change. So, for example, for a lot of people, it's not going to be a question of, okay, does this policy affect you or not? But for a lot of people, the fact that it affects their children, affects their grandchildren matters a lot more. And I think that can be used to drive public policy in many interesting ways. To give you an example, if one looks at the queer rights movement in the US, and obviously it's taken many decades for them to come to a position where the marriage equality verdict was passed, the behavioral change ads that were most effective in effect swaying public opinion were those where parents of homosexual individuals came on camera and said, okay, this was our journey of acceptance. And that resonated very well with a lot of people who themselves had children. So I think creating that shared culture of caring through behavioral change, through the right messaging, etc., would also help in building a long-term view among citizens.
Yeah, thanks, Pat. There's another question by Vanshika Singh. Usually, when we look at youth transitions, the term assume a process where adulthood is achieved, not just a universal adult franchise, but also a sense of agency. It's usually mapped through stabilized and secure labor participation. Given your nuanced comments on the role of state capacity and appreciation of specifics, do we have a sense or an understanding of youth transition in India that works for us?
So again, this is a term in particular, Vanshika, that I'm not particularly familiar with. So my answer might not directly respond to your question, but let me try to give it as good a chance as I can. So because you have references obviously to stabilize and secure labor participation, and therefore in that context, a sense and understanding of youth transition in India. So firstly, again, look, I don't necessarily agree with this kind of dichotomy of youth versus non-youth or whatever else we might or children, etc. At the end of the day, every voting bloc has a certain interest in the state. You might argue that, look, in early childhood, obviously someone's not equipped from a knowledge perspective, but then we can also look at, for example, things like reducing the voting age. When it was brought down from 25 to 21 in the 1980s, that was a very heated discussion. The question people always ask, and I'm sure you've heard, is if at 18 you can drink or drive a car, then why not vote as well? But also many countries have actually explored reducing that 18 to 16, saying if you are, in fact, in the context of India, if you are going to start trying in some heinous crimes, people of 16 years as adults, then might as well give them the right to vote as well. So obviously lowering both the age of voting as well as the age of becoming an MP becomes an important part in getting more youth into the political process. But to your question about a stable labor force participation, I might even, in fact, expand it broader and say that it's not obviously just about labor, but it's about what Amartya Sen would call the capabilities approach, right? Your health, your education. If you're perennially sick for whatever reason because you don't have the right public, the public health infrastructure is not good enough, or you've not had the right kind of education, or your educational content and pedagogy has not been good enough, then that also reduces your ability to participate in public processes and lead to that kind of policy change. So I would actually encourage us to then start looking at some of these prerequisites for meaningful life as the ability to therefore engage in public policy process. And I think especially in the context of marginalized communities. So to that extent, I think the second aspect of youth participation in some of these issues that we're talking about will boil down to how much of a level playing field are we created? The fact that I can sit here on a weekday afternoon and talk about these issues and you can listen to these issues obviously already points to a certain level of privilege, certain aspects of our lives. And how do we get more people to have that kind of privilege to be able to participate in these processes becomes a key question.
That's very interesting. I think we are almost out of time. We'll take maybe one last question. This question is from Aisha Khanam. The retail donation point was highly relevant. Could you elaborate on how retail donation points can be used to engage youth in philanthropic, civic, or any other activities that contribute to building state capacity, especially as we observe more initiatives being aligned with the interests of the elected officials?
Thank you for that question, Aisha. It's a very interesting and important question. The way I look at volunteering and retail donation were those separate points. I think to that extent, you can do volunteering, but not retail donation, but not volunteering, and both of those are fine. But to the extent that your question was about volunteering/retail donation as a means to kind of engage more people and build more capacity, at the end of the day, you care more about the issues that you put your money on and vice versa. The causes that you donate to are also the causes that you care about and vice versa. So to that extent, I do think young people and all people donating or participating or helping nonprofits, think tanks, etc., do their work becomes critically important, and they will be more motivated if they do it. But the second and important thing is, I, for 5 years of my life, worked on funding think tanks and kind of building their capacity. And unfortunately, in India, because so much of our focus is on what is called the roti kapda makan issues in terms of development, that we are not thinking about state capacity issues. We're not thinking about democracy, human rights, and those civil rights issues. And those kind of organizations tend to be perennially underfunded. If you look at the budget of India's largest think tanks and compare it to the budget of the US's largest think tank, it's not even in the proportion of our GDP. It's far divergent than that. In India, these issues around civil liberties, around think tanks, around knowledge creation tend to be underfunded. So one of the things we could do is to support more of these organizations which work on that. And the reason we are not able to do this is twofold. One is with their impact is not directly visible. You don't get a photo of a poor kid in school, or you don't get a photo of someone in a hospital, and therefore you think their work is less important, which is obviously not true. But secondly, and as we have discussed several times in this discussion, that it's more long-term impact. And therefore, for someone who wants that immediate Instagrammable satisfaction of having affected someone's life, this is something that plays out in ambiguous ways and plays out in the long term. So to that extent, the ability of us as young people and people who are interested to build more of a retail donor base, especially in for these underfunded areas, becomes very critical.
That's a very brilliant viewpoint, and I want to thank you so much for agreeing to participate and to able to speak with us. And I think you were the perfect guest to discuss on this topic, and because of the different, the diversity of experience that you come from. And thank you so much for taking the time out from your busy schedule and sharing your expertise and insights with us. Also to our audience, thank you for taking the time to join us and actually contributing to the questions and your reflections on the Q&A box. Thank you so much, and thank you so much, Subhashish.
Thank you so much, Abhinav, for having me. Really enjoyed this.